In a moment, you'll hear from our wonderful new colleagues, Cassandra Gillig, Clara and Mindi Zhang, discussing their research projects. Before that, though, I want to welcome our new bibliographers by harking back to an old one. The mid-19th century, and she is the mid-19th century Boston writer, Anna Cabot Lowell Quincy Waterston. And if you know anything about Boston in this era, with that string of last names, she is part of a certain set of Boston social royalty. She was indeed the descendant of presidents of Harvard and of these United States. She was a Unitarian and an abolitionist, and she was a bibliomaniac. And also, having just closed the anniversary year, it's also worth noting that that some of you may recognize her name because of her essay on Jane Austen, which appeared in The Atlantic in 1863. But it's an essay that she wrote 2 years later for that same magazine that I want to pause on. Because in it, she contemplates the visible and invisible in libraries in a way that I hope will set the tone for our discussions today. Opening that essay, she writes, "What is unseen forms the real value of the library. The type, the paper, the binding, the age are all visible, but the soul that conceived it, the mind that arranged it, the hand that wrote it, the associations which cling to it, are the invisible links in a long chain of thought, effort, and history which make the book what it is." And so one, I hope you agree with me that this is a beautiful meditation on the subject that brings us together as we study texts as artifacts and find in them reflections of the people and cultures that created, acquired, and exchanged them. And two, I think this is particularly appropriate for the work of the New Scholars Program as we, and here by we I mean not the New Scholars Committee, but we, as the membership of the BSA, create the links in our own chain of thought, effort, and history, which make the study of the book what it is. And I use book very loosely. To that end, the New Scholars Program has, for several decades, sought to extend that chain by promoting the work of new bibliographers through the generous support of the Malkin, Panzer, Blanck, McKenzie, Porter Wesley, and New Scholars Awards, as well as their donors. In this program, we have welcomed papers from graduate students, librarians, booksellers, and other bibliophiles discussing a wide range of topics, including bastard hands, dramatic pilcrows, the markets for Shakespeare and Charlotte Bronte, Yiddish printing in post-war Poland, Mao-era paper shortages, and the feminist bibliography of homemade books. This year, we extend that list even further with presentations on the struggles, labor, and intersectional commitments of 1990s LGBT publishing, the rehabilitation of lithography's artistic reputation in the earliest 20th century, and the Biblio-Internationalism of Chinese rare books. And with that, I want to turn to our speakers. As a point of order, I'll introduce everybody in order now. They'll come up one by one, and then I'll ask a question to get the conversation started, and I hope you all will join me in a lively discussion with our new scholars. Our first speaker, Cassandra Gillig, is a writer and MFA, MA candidate in the Creative Nonfiction program at Northwestern University. Gillig was a 2024 Cornell University Zwickler Research Fellow for work on Leslie Feinberg and Firebrand books. Cassandra's project on Davina Ann Gabrielle and Trans Sisters, the Journal of Transsexual Feminism, received a 2025 KC Inspiration Grant and is part of the forthcoming book and digital archive, An Era of Rights, published by the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Clara is a PhD candidate at the Courtauld Institute of Art, specializing in printmaking histories. She is currently exploring the rhetoric and cultural networks related to the second revival of artistic lithography in Britain, circa 1900 to 1920. She received her master's in the history of art from the Courtauld and her bachelor's in art history and museum studies from Mount Holyoke. She has presented on the materiality of lithography at the 2025 Association for Art History Annual Conference and is a reviews editor for Mediations, the Courtauld Institute of Art Journal of Postgraduate Research. Her talk today is derived from the second chapter of her doctoral dissertation. And last but not least, Mindi Zhang is a PhD candidate in modern Chinese history at UCLA. He is broadly interested in the history of books, history of libraries, and history of science and technology. Zhang's dissertation examines the institutionalization of Chinese research libraries in the first half of the 20th century against a backdrop of Sino-US exchange. It examines how these institutions blended early modern Chinese bibliographical tradition with 20th century library methods and technologies. Part of the dissertation traces the growth of sinological collections in the US, in which Chinese librarians and bibliographers played a vital role. Zhang is a junior fellow in the Andrew W. Mellon Society of Fellows of Critical Bibliography at the Rare Book School. And with that, I would ask you to please join me in welcoming Cassandra Gillig for our first presentation.
Thank you so much. I'm going to adjust this. This is our clicker. The clicker has a button that says laser, which I would like to press, but maybe I'll wait for the right moment. Hi, my name is Cassandra Gillig. I'm a new scholar, but prior to returning to grad school, I was the librarian for 10 years. So I think the way that I approach everything is as a librarian. And I'm deeply soothed to be in this room full of gigantic nerds. So thank you for joining me. Before I start, I want to thank Brenda Marston, the curator of the Human Sexuality Collection at Cornell University. I received a fellowship over the summer to go visit these collections that are completely amazing and completely the result of the labor of Brenda advocating for queer and trans materials to be preserved at Cornell. I think that people often don't understand the political work that's involved in advocating for these materials to actually be preserved and be important and be viewed. So most of the photographs that I'm going to share with you today are from those collections. And this opening slide here, you can see on the left, I've got the Stone Butch Blues. The joke name of my talk, I have Stone Butch Blues, actually has a lineage in pin jokes. And on the right here, we have a photograph of Leslie Feinberg, the author of Stone Butch Blues, reading at Charis Books in Atlanta, which is the oldest women's bookstore in the South. Yeah, still going strong, absolutely. You can still buy Stone Butch Blues at Charis Books. In 1992, at the encouragement of lesbian feminist writers Amber Hollabaugh, Jewel Gomez, and Dorothy Ellison, Leslie Feinberg wrote to Nancy Bariano, the editor and publisher of Firebrand Books. Feinberg was sending off the first draft of Stone Butch Blues, her debut foray into fiction writing after spending years as a factory worker, typesetter, organizer, and editor for the Workers' World newspaper. Before the sex debates of the last 10 years, I don't think this novel would have been taken seriously in the lesbian feminist community, she wrote. Working class butch women and women who lived by passing as men were suspect in that movement. Like lesbian women of color and working class lesbians generally, we were seen as marginal even though we actually make up the vast majority. Feinberg spoke from the painfully well-occupied margins of what was already a deeply marginalized movement, and in this, she was able to activate a devoted readership that persists to this day. Here we have a photograph of that letter I was reading from, and one of the things I really like about this is you can see kind of the intimacy of the press. Through the second page here, we have Leslie giving her home phone number. This was really just a letter sent to someone who she was encountering in the world. Met with immediate acclaim and positive sales, Stone Butch Blues remains one of the most enduringly read and widely discussed titles from the lesbian print movement. Though widely canonized for its novelistic content, this talk shifts focus to consider the publication infrastructure that has allowed Stone Butch Blues to find a permanent home everywhere from community reading groups to university classrooms. After selling 60,000 copies in its first 7 years in print, the novel struggled with the closure of 2 different indie publishers that left Feinberg in copyright battles and eventually resulted in her choice to self-publish free and at-cost versions. Reading Stone Butch Blues' publication records, editorial correspondence, contracts, fan mail, desk copy requests, and marketing materials, one comes to understand the components of a genre-changing independent press bestseller. Stone Butch Blues offers a significant case study in the end of the LGBT small press movement, exemplifying the ways that minoritized literary titles can signal changing political tides and catalyze new field formations. Here we have another photo of Leslie to the left, and then this photo on the right is actually a still photo from when Leslie appeared with Kate Bornstein on the Joan Rivers show in the early 90s. So that's the book stylized for public presentation. Next are probably some fake flowers. Published by Firebrand Books in March 1993, amidst a tumultuous year for trans activism, Stone Butch Blues laid the groundwork for a new contemporary trans literature. Its story traces the life of Jess Goldberg, a working-class butch who finds community in the 50s Buffalo, New York lesbian bar scene. Goldberg navigates the precarious employment and danger attached to her gender nonconformity, the decision to start and stop medically transitioning, and the lifelong project of coming into one's own inside the expectations of a lesbian community and broader world. Feinberg's bio famously stated she was a, quote, anti-racist, white, working-class, secular, Jewish, transgender, lesbian, female, revolutionary communist. And she built the complexities of these commitments and experiences into her work. Stone Butch Blues is a novel that always thinks beyond its protagonist, painting self-actualization alongside homophobic and transphobic police brutality, the racial politics of early lesbian spaces, labor organizing, and queer community building. Not without its critiques, both past and present, Stone Butch Blues remains a vital read in its ability to thread the changing tides of lesbian discourse across time. Feinberg's book took on doubly controversial subject matter. In 1993, long-standing debates on whether butch and femme lesbians detracted from the project of liberation were still of community concern. Feinberg's novel marries butch-femme discourse with discussion of the nascent transgender liberation movement and alienation of trans people in lesbian circles. In her piece, Building Bridges, published in the first issue of groundbreaking lesbian trans feminist magazine Trans Sisters, Feinberg writes, I am a transgendered activist, I am a lesbian, I am the way I am, I love who I love, I have a right to be whole. Trying to choose one identity over the other would be as untenable as standing with a foot in each of two rowboats drifting apart. Much of Feinberg's work records the uphill battle of studying oneself on this shaky terrain. Feinberg's 1992 pamphlet, Transgender Liberation, A Movement Whose Time Has Come, opens with a concise goal, quote, to trace the historic rise of an oppression that as yet has no commonly agreed upon name. As Feinberg would reiterate throughout her work, if you don't name an oppression, you can't fight it. This slippery project of pinning down trans and its associated histories is part of what drew Feinberg and other activists of the era to the term transgender. For Feinberg, transgender was a coalitional tool, something that could reach wide enough to make space for any person who had a different experience of gender. As Feinberg notes in the supplemental materials for the 20th anniversary of Stone Butch Blues, the word transgender evolved significantly in the 2 decades after its first use. Here we have 2 of Feinberg's early pamphlets, notably published by the Worldview Publishers, which was a print arm of the Workers' World Party, and you can see on the left here some of the ads for other titles they were putting out, also considered gay issues. Nancy Bariano started Firebrand Books in 1984, part of a new wave of presses interested in expanding the voices and discourses of lesbian publishing. These presses came into their editorial methodologies during the nascent sex wars, beginning of the AIDS crisis, and ever-dwindling public arts funding. Bariano's author roster was driven by a particularly generative kind of curiosity that pursued the fullest possible portrait of lesbian life and published writers as significant and varied as Audre Lorde, Dorothy Allison, and Alison Bechdel. The Firebrand Books records illustrate Nancy Bariano's meticulous record keeping, doubling as an outline of her overwhelming daily efforts in keeping the press afloat. Bariano's tasks included everything from responding to manuscripts to answering author inquiries, fulfilling review and desk copy requests, paying royalties, talking to distributors and printers, balancing finances, planning for printings, responding to fan mail, coordinating readings, pitching reviews, writing copy, and corresponding with authors. In the straightforward and comprehensive records of a small press, one comes to see the way that a book's livelihood can be dictated by the responsiveness and proactivity of its publisher. Working with a part-time assistant and the occasional contracted employee or intern, Bariano almost single-handedly supported her authors and often prioritized their royalty payments over the press's own financial security. By the end of its publishing tenure, Firebrand had over 80 books in print, managing massive amounts of logistics for each of their authors and books. Here you can see some of the kind of ways that Firebrand Books sought to establish itself. Lesbian literature on the reading edge. Every society honors its live conformists and its dead troublemakers. And then at the bottom of this pamphlet or handout on the left, we have Stone Butch Blues as it was sent out to a lot of people on the marketing list who would have been a lot of booksellers, a lot of past folks who bought directly from the press. 1993 was a watershed year in trans organizing, with the fight to include transgender people in the March on Washington for lesbian, gay, and bi rights, the beginning of activist group Transsexual Menace, and continuing protests of trans exclusion at the Michigan Women's Music Festival. Publishing a book like Stone Butch Blues at this time in lesbian and trans history was a clear political statement. Upon first receiving Feinberg's manuscript, Bariano stayed up all night reading it, something she'd never done with another. I read it on the power of what was in the book, Bariano detailed in an oral history with literary scholar Alec Pollock. Bariano didn't immediately recognize its political stakes, just knew that it was something that made her feel she had so much to learn. Here on the left, we have a flyer for the first release book signing party for Stone Butch Blues. Something that I think is really fantastic about this flyer is at the bottom, it has all of the sponsoring committees. So you can see the level of community engagement. We have everything from ACT UP to a songwriter to Contemporary Arts Center. A lot of people have been working alongside Leslie in Buffalo for everything from reproductive rights to workers' rights, and she had made quite a community of people who shared her values. And then on the right, we have a photograph from Camp Trans, which is the counter-protest that was happening outside of the Michigan Women's Music Festival every year after 1991, after a trans woman was ejected from the festival. That's Leslie as the second person, and then the fourth person in this photograph is Jameson Green, who was the editor of the FTM newsletter and a very significant member in the organizing community. It's complicated to track and assemble a trans literary canon given the modern emergence of trans as an identity category and the myriad terms used to describe gender nonconformity over time. Considering both this and the novel's content, the marketing and professional copy for Stone Butch Blues is fittingly unable to develop consistent language in describing the book. When submitting Stone Butch Blues to the Library of Congress in January 1993, Firebrand described it as a, quote, novel exploring the complexities of being a transgendered person in a world demanding simple explanations. A month later, the book's ISBN application read, quote, a novel about a contemporary lesbian passing as a man in order to survive and then coming to terms with herself. While the book jacket's copy included a mixture of both, Stone Butch Blues' official press release doesn't use the word transgender, instead opting for, quote, differently gendered, passing as a man, and he, she. In both mainstream and gay press coverage, the range of terminology used demonstrates a still assembling vocabulary around the emergent category of transgender, which sometimes collapses sex, gender, and sexuality altogether. And here we have a spread of media representation. On the left, we have a local Buffalo paper. In the middle, we have Sojourner, which was a leftist women's magazine published out of the South. And then the third, we have the FTM newsletter, who Jameson Green in that last photo edited. So you can see kind of a shifting in understanding the work and stakes of Leslie here. The success of Stone Butch Blues was immediate. The novel sold out of its initial 5,000 copy print run in 90 days. The typical first run for a Firebrand book was 3,000 copies, and many of its authors never needed a second. In the course of its 7 years of being published by Firebrand, the novel sold over 60,000 copies. Stone Butch Blues found an audience of deeply engaged readers and made a place for gender nonconforming writing in lesbian spaces. In the wake of the novel's popularity, Firebrand would publish Minnie Bruce Pratt, Leslie Feinberg's partner's book Z in 1995, and Transsexual Menace co-founder Ricky Ann Wilkins' first book, Read My Lips, in 1997. These were two other significant titles in the non-academic theorizing and depiction of trans and gender nonconforming life. While Stone Butch Blues won a Lambda Literary Award for lesbian fiction in 1994, Lambda, the premier organization for gay and lesbian literature, would not include a transgender category until it was established as a catch-all award for fiction, nonfiction, and poetry in 1997. A trans fiction category would not arrive until 2009. Even in the years of academic books, essay collections, and memoirs that would follow, the trans-authored trans novel remained a particular outlier. A useful accompaniment to emerging curriculums on queer theory, one of the biggest forces of impact for Stone Butch Blues was its immediate uptake in the university. Looking through hundreds of requests for desk and exam copies, Stone Butch Blues proved a versatile course text that was beginning to be integrated into syllabi only a few months after its release. In 1994 alone, professors across nearly every type of institution in every part of the country proposed courses with the novel. It found applications across gender studies, history, philosophy, sociology, anthropology, English, environmental studies, legal studies, and health education. The novel is still regularly taught in classrooms today. In summer 2000, Nancy Bariano sold Firebrand Books to LPC Group. As reported in Publishers Weekly, June and July of 2000 alone saw the Firebrand sale, the sale and downsizing of the oldest lesbian publisher at the time, Naiad Press, the end of longstanding trade publication Feminist Bookstore News, and the closure of Glad Day Bookshop, a Toronto LGBT bookstore that had been open since 1970. LPC Group defaulted on a $1 million loan and filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in April 2002. In an expensive legal battle, Feinberg recovered the rights to Stone Butch Blues and sold them to LGBT small press publisher Ellison Books for republication. The 2003 Ellison Books edition of Stone Butch Blues reflects on the novel's life during its 10 years in print. Feinberg wrote, "When Stone Butch Blues was published, I thought I would keep cartons of copies in my closet to give out to people who were ready to read it. But this book, like the movements for social change it was inextricably connected with, exploded the closet door off its hinges." In the intervening decade, Feinberg received hundreds of thousands of letters, emails, and phone calls, the life of the book far outpacing any publication statistics one could offer. Ellison faced similar problems to Firebrand, however, and the distribution of Stone Butch Blues was once again placed into jeopardy when it was acquired by a massive and failing LGBT media conglomerate called Regent Media. Once again, forced into a legal battle over rights for the novel, Feinberg emerged with a commitment to prioritize publication of the work above all else. In the last months of Feinberg's life, she and her partner, poet and essayist Minnie Bruce Pratt, worked on 20th anniversary edition of Stone Butch Blues, dedicated to C.C. McDonald, a Black trans activist who had been jailed on a predatory manslaughter charge after defending herself in an attack. This edition sought to create easy access in line with Feinberg's politics, but not in a way that might result, once again, in the book going out of print. In addition to a free PDF posted to Feinberg's website, the final edition of the book was made available for purchase at cost through print-on-demand site Lulu. In its note on copyrights, Feinberg wrote, "I have retained full author copyright to Stone Butch Blues rather than license this 20th anniversary edition through Creative Commons. The reason is not out of a fetish of ownership of property, but rather to protect my work from being exploited commercially by corporations." Here we have the 3 editions. Stone Butch Blues has had 930,000 downloads from Feinberg's site, is regularly purchased through print-on-demand channels, and is read in translations across nearly a dozen languages, all of which are also bound to Feinberg's commitment to free or at-cost access. At this point in its circulation, many more have encountered Stone Butch Blues in digital form than as a printed book. To this end, it has become one of the most widely read self-published novels outside of the genre and fan fiction worlds. As with the efforts of the first waves of gay and lesbian publishers, when the available publishing infrastructure was insufficient, Feinberg created her own. As Feinberg reflected in the 10th edition of Stone Butch Blues, "With this novel, I planted a flag. Here I am. Does anyone else want to discuss these important issues? I wrote it not as an expression of individual high art, but as a working class organizer mimeographs a leaflet, a call to action. More than anything, Stone Butch Blues was created as an urgent document and found a way to persist in whatever form it needed to take. Using the momentum around her work, first created by small press care, Feinberg built an infrastructure that has sustained her legacy long beyond her passing and introduced millions of new readers to Stone Butch Blues, creating the possibility for a new kind of transliterature along the way. And these are two photos of Feinberg later in life. You can see Queers Don't Buy This War. And then on the right, we have her at a protest to free C.C. McDonald, also on her sign, Free Chelsea Manning, Ground the Drones. Throughout her life and throughout her book tours, Feinberg was always adamantly injecting the room with her politics and with a call to not only read lesbian literature, read trans literature, but also to think critically about United States imperialism and the liberation of Palestinian people. I will end on that note. Thank you all so much.
All right. Thank you for the BSA for inviting me to give this talk, and it's been wonderful to hear everyone's research today. In London, between November 1907 and August 1908, a lithography teacher, a socialist children's author, a leader of the calligraphic revival, and a lithography student became the four editors of an art and literature magazine called the Neolith. Like similar publications, the Neolith's 4 issues displayed original prints alongside contemporary prose and poetry. The Neolith's uniqueness, however, lay in its production. Periodicals typically employed a combination of typefaces for text and print mediums like wood engraving, etching, or photomechanical processes for the images. In contrast, the Neolith employed a single medium, lithography, for cover, artwork, and text. Articles reviewing the Neolith were sure to point out its novelty among artistic publications. Lithography, for those who aren't familiar, is a deceptively complex printing process. The process is based on the principle that oil and water do not mix. The artist typically draws with a lithographic stone or paper using an oil-based crayon. Chemicals are applied and a reaction occurs, fixing this greasy image. The surface is dampened with water, which only the negative areas absorb. Ink is then applied with a roller, only adhering to the greasy areas. And finally, the stone and paper are run through a lithographic press. In short, the process is time-consuming and temperamental. Furthermore, at the time, lithography was snubbed by the art world because it was the preferred medium for the large printing firms that produced advertisements and reproductions of popular artwork. So that all begs the question, why did the editors of the Neolith embark on this experiment? In this talk, I will argue that the exclusive use of lithography allowed for an intimate and symbiotic relationship between the images and the text, which together formed a unified address to the British public. Unlike many contemporary magazines, neither the first nor subsequent issues of the Neolith contained a mission statement or editorial notes. The closest to an official manifesto is a lengthy statement given by the editors to the London Daily Chronicle, which asserts that, quote, "Our idea is not only to revive lithography, but also by its help to bring the work of distinguished artists within reach of people who cannot afford 2 or 3 guineas for a print." The statement presents the Neolith as an ideological project, advancing 2 frontiers, freeing lithography from the taint of commercialization, and more crucially for this talk, expanding art collecting to a wider audience. So who were these editors, and why might they be interested in such a project? The Neolith grew from the climate of the Central School of Arts and Crafts, where artistic lithography was being promoted by Francis Ernest Jackson. While we don't have time to fully discuss the issue of the lithographic revival here, suffice it to say that as a result of lithography's commercialization, it was only taught at trade schools. Jackson was the first to teach lithography to students pursuing fine art rather than commercial printing careers. And Jackson, who oversaw the magazine's technical production, brought the idea for an entirely lithographic publication to his colleagues, and eventually gained the interest of Grayley Hewitt and Gerald Spencer Price. Hewitt, who taught calligraphy and would play a key role in its revival, was an obvious choice to tackle the magazine's text, which would have to be painstakingly handwritten on lithographic transfer paper. Price was a student of lithography and comparatively unknown. He was nonetheless selected as the magazine's art editor. And with the artistic side suitably covered, there remained the role of literary editor, and Price reached out to his close friend and frequent patron, children's author Edith Nesbit. In addition to her literary career, Nesbit was well known as a founding member of the Fabian Society, a British socialist organization. I suggest that participation in the Neolith stemmed from Nesbit's interest in creating a literary magazine with Fabian contributors. The Liberal Party's victory in the previous year, as well as the increasing success of the New Labour Party, had revitalized radical politics. Bolstered by the promise of new policies to better the condition of the nation's working class and poor, membership of socialist groups soared, as did their outreach. Nesbit confessed her interest in establishing a socialist paper in a 1907 letter to Alfred Richard Orridge, who is here illustrated by Jackson in the Neolith's first issue. Orridge had just begun his editorship of the popular art and literature socialist weekly, The New Age. So Nesbit's recruitment of fellow Fabians for the Neolith, who included George Bernard Shaw and the brothers G.K. and Cecil Chesterton, suggests that the magazine was an outlet for her desire to be involved in a socialist project. There is no doubt that the target audience for the Neolith was the rising lower middle class. The Neolith's affordability, highlighted by the editors, was echoed by reviews which consistently noted its accessibility for the, quote, ordinary man. For context, the price of a single issue of the Neolith was comparable to a ticket to the newly opened Queen's Theatre in London. Additionally, while single issues of the Neolith were not as cheap as newspapers or the Studio, they were in line with the Yellow Book and the Dial. Additionally, limited editions of signed artist proofs on specially selected paper ranged from 10 shillings to £2.20. This was a bargain considering that lithographs by British artists offered in galleries went for between £2 and £4. And it's even more of a bargain when you consider that the prints in the Neolith themselves were about folio size, so quite large. And this pricing emphasizes the Neolith's attempt to make print collecting accessible for the lower classes. But how did the Neolith's contents address this audience? Of the 31 short stories and poems, nearly all text with a specified location take place in England, follow British working class or impoverished characters, and largely dwell on the moralistic effects of poverty. Furthermore, Nesbit encouraged the authors to tell the, quote, plain, naked, unashamed truth in the most beautiful English, and they may be as plain-spoken as they will. For example, the Neolith's first issue debuted Shaw's story, Aerial Football, the New Game, seen here. A satirical take on British society, Shaw's story follows an alcoholic woman and a bishop who were recently killed in the same bus accident. Upon reaching the pearly gates, they both hesitate to enter. The poor woman wonders if she has been sent to the wrong place. The pompous bishop, however, wonders if he might be at the wrong gate, asking St. Peter if this was instead the tradesman's entrance. Ultimately, class differences are leveled when the bishop recognizes his vanity, rolls his vestments into a ball, and kicks them into the air, instigating a game of soccer. Here, Shaw elevates soccer from an exclusively working-class pastime to one played by St. Peter and the angels. The social commentary is strengthened by rooting the story in contemporary London. With a few exceptions, the 25 lithographs published in the Neolith depict quotidian life, likewise favoring representations of the lower middle or working classes. For example, here we see Archibald Standish Hartrick's depiction of a London rat catcher. While never given specifically British titles, I suggest the image's association with the deliberately British text firmly locates most of the subjects within Britain. The collaboration of image and text is apparent from the issue's first pages, as the viewer is confronted with the crisis of poverty. On the left, Edmund J. Sullivan's depiction of an itinerant blacksmith looks at the viewer with tired eyes below bushy brows and unkempt hair. His coat merges with the dark background, while his face is softly lit, conveying his social concealment. Opposite the portrait is G.K. Chesterton's poem, The Secret People, a first-person recounting of the anonymity of the English working class from the time of the Plantagenet kings to the present. The opening line is a striking accompaniment to its wary companion. It reads, Smile at us, pay us, pass us, but do not quite forget, for we are the people of England that never has spoken yet. With this pairing, Chesterton seemingly gives voice to Sullivan's blacksmith. The association is subtle, but the message is clear. The lithographs, as both image and text, observe and respond to contemporary British culture for a contemporary British audience. Throughout the 4 volumes, the image's thematic similarity to, but not illustration of, the adjacent text reflects the period's rejection of the Victorian rhetoric of illustration. The proliferation of illustrated newspapers and novels in the 19th century had conditioned an increasingly literate British public to see as well as read, making art almost entirely supplementary. As Linda Dowling explored in her article on literary periodicals at the turn of the century, art and literature magazines like the Yellow Book, the Whirlwind, and the Dial rejected this subordination of image to text by granting the image autonomy. Foremost, they included images that had no direct relation to the text, as seen in the Neolith. While the Neolith benefited from these earlier radical publications, its approach was in many ways distinct. The publications strove not for the image's autonomy from text, but for its equality, as both elements were presented as fine examples of lithography. For example, some publications like the Yellow Book and the Studio physically separated their images by not binding them with the text or by inserting fly titles and guard sheets. In contrast, the Neolith images are not bound differently or separated. Instead, they appear amidst the stories printed on the same wove paper. The Yellow Book took it a step farther, adopting dual content pages for literature and art segments. Alternatively, the Neolith's singular table of contents subtly differentiates the 2 contributions by having the page number justified right for image and left for text. The page layout further serves to marry the 2 elements. The size of the facing lithographs typically mirror the body of text. In most cases, both inner margins are the narrowest, with the outer margins growing incrementally wider. Ultimately, throughout the Neolith, neither word nor work took precedence, as both served to engage its public. The treatment of the images and text themselves further strengthened the audience connection to the material. The image's sketch-like energy and the irregularity of the handwritten text removes any mechanical or impersonal barrier standing between the viewer and the content. Nesbit remarked on lithography's ability to, quote, bring the artist nearer the public. She echoes the rhetoric surrounding lithography, which emphasizes the ability to preserve the artist's hand. Reviews of the Neolith further recognize the tangibility of the artist by using words like truth and tenderness to describe the lithographic effect. Artists draw attention to the fact that the lithographs were not transferred to the page via photomechanical reproduction, but instead were drawn, seemingly right onto the page. In some cases, the artist's frenetic lines break through their border. Others have no border at all, leaving the edges of the drawing raw. Likewise, the manuscript-like quality of Hewitt's text is evident in the signs of corrections and the traces of ruled lines. Note also the accidental mark left of Brangwen's fisherman in the red box. I'd like to draw your attention to one last image, perhaps the Neolith's most imaginative comment on England's socioeconomic structure. Although inspired by ancient river gods, James Keir-Lawson's personification of the Thames is not modeled after the antique, as Gustave Doré's in the previous century, but after the destitute. Thin and haggard, he looks more like an impoverished man sleeping beside the river than its personification. The exactitude of the London skyline towering prominently enforces a sense of irony. London's most recognizable icons are its impressive buildings and its poor. Recounting the end of the Neolith, Hartrick casts it as a child who was the fatal consequence of neglect, ironically a theme of several short stories. Ultimately, the project had reached its peak. Lithography proved too unsuitable a method for that degree of handwritten text, which Hewitt described as a, quote, nightmare of struggle. Additionally, submissions were frequently late, and Nesbit's turbulent personality and unconventional leadership style were not compatible with Jackson's more direct collaboration. Conjecturing on the publication's profitability, historians and biographers have dubbed the Neolith a failure. However, this ignores the magazine's mission, which was not to make money, but to make art and literature which the British public might respond well to. And in this regard, I believe the project is a success. There were favorable reviews from London to Dublin, and even in the United States. Additionally, all the lithographs were acquired for the nation by the British Museum. It also succeeded in exciting artists who would be involved with the subsequent revival of artistic lithography. So while the Neolith's collaboration was at an end, the project heralded a relationship between artistic lithography and the British public that was only just beginning. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for being here, and thank BSA for organizing this wonderful meeting, and don't fall asleep as I'm the last one to go. Okay, so can you hear me all right? Okay, so the Library of Congress now has one of the largest Chinese rare book collections outside of East Asia. So today I want to discuss a critical stage on its long history of collecting Chinese before and during World War II, when a partnership was developed between the Library of Congress and the National Beiping Library of China, located in today's Beijing. And I will talk about why and how classical Chinese books reached the Library of Congress through this partnership. But first, let me explain what I mean by the title, Biblio-Internationalism. So my definition draws on the work of Akira Iriye. So in his study of the history of cultural internationalism, Iriye traces a surge in international collaboration and exchange in areas such as education, science, and scholarship in the period between the two world wars. He argues that this surge was driven by a belief in the importance of a mutual understanding of the culture, language, and history between peoples from different nations. At the same time, internationalists embraced these collaborations not just to promote cross-cultural understanding, but also to meet their distinct national or nationalist goals. What follows centers on the activities of Yuan Tongli, the director of the National Beiping Library, in fostering a mutually productive collaboration between the two national libraries. I argue that Yuan's actions were motivated by an internationalism involving both an effort to expand an infrastructure in the US for American sinology, that is the study of China, and also an endeavor to obtain critical resources and support from the US for the Chinese academic community. And I call this Biblio-Internationalism because the collaboration revolved around the exchange, preservation, and study of classical Chinese books. So, who was Yuan Tongli? Yuan grew up in a scholarly environment that gained him access to the network of book collectors in early 20th century Beijing, including some of the most prominent bibliophiles in North China at the time. He received his BA from Columbia University and a diploma from the New York State Library School. And he worked during the early 1920s in the Library of Congress for 3 summers as an intern, an experience that gave him first-hand knowledge of the Chinese collection there. Upon returning to China in 1926, he was appointed as the librarian of the newly established Peking Library, which was reorganized as the National Beiping Library under the Chinese nationalist government, with Yuan as the acting director. The library was the largest collection of old Chinese books in China, mainly because it inherited the court collections from the Qing dynasty, which fell in 1912. But Yuan was also active in soliciting donations and exchanges through which the library could receive modern publications from institutions across the world in order to support the various academic fields that were then taking shape in China. So we can see that as a library director, Yuan really occupied a very distinct social institutional position. He had one foot on the sort of old-fashioned bibliophile circle that was still very active at the time. The other foot on the modern, more westernized academic research community in China, and also he was well connected with American librarians and scholars because of his experience in the US. Yuan became acquainted with Walter Swingle during his internship at the Library of Congress. an employee of the US Department of Agriculture, Swingle was an internationalist who stressed the importance of studying China for good relationship with the Chinese people and also for learning something practical from Chinese history. As a plant scientist, he believed that Chinese crops had the potential to enrich American agricultural practice. So for this purpose, he began to work with the Library of Congress starting around 1915 and steered the direction of its Chinese acquisition for well over a decade, with an emphasis on local gazetteers, materia medica, and agricultural books. So these are kinds of books that you tend to find information on agriculture, on sericulture, on plants, on medicine. So Yuan knew very well what Swingle wanted and supplied him rare editions of some of these books. For example, in 1927, he sent Swingle a manuscript facsimile of the 11th century treatise on lychee. The facsimile was from a copy in the 18th century imperial collection, the Siku Quanshu, that was stored in the Forbidden Palace, which was then being transformed into the Palace Museum. So this copy of Siku Quanshu was not in the National Beiping Library, but a combination of his connection in Beijing and his professional credential as a librarian earned him the concurrent position of the deputy director of the Library of the Palace Museum. So in this capacity, Yuan had access to all the book collections in the former imperial complex, a privilege he took advantage of in making a copy for international colleagues like Swingle. In 1933, he offered a photostat copy of the Ming period Biji, also germane to Swingle's interest. The book was only recently acquired by Yuan's staff at the National Beiping Library and was considered a very rare copy. So photostating was still a relatively recent technology at the time, and in China, there were only 2 photostat machines, one in Yuan's library that he bought from the US. So for the purpose of rare book exchange, what photostating allowed him to do was to make copies of texts for international colleagues like Swingle, while also ensuring the domestic custody of the original book. This was actually a major concern for the Chinese because in the decades prior to 1930, numerous cultural objects, not just rare books, but like bronze vessels, murals, and sculptures were taken out of China by foreign expeditions. So the idea of national cultural heritage was developed, that needed domestic protection was developed in response to this recent history of imperialism. And in 1931, the Chinese government also passed a law that prohibited the export of cultural relics prior to 1850. So in this context, the photographic technology's ability to separate texts from their traditional medium would fulfill the national imperative of safeguarding rare books while also ensuring the text's international circulation. Starting from 1928, Yuan worked more closely with Arthur Hummel, who was appointed as the head of the LC's newly created Division of Orientalia. A former missionary to China, Hummel was an internationalist just like Swingle. But as a professional sinologist, Hummel wanted to build the division into a more comprehensive collection and to make the LC a center of worldwide sinological research. As a result, Yuan sent Hummel whatever he could get hands on in Beijing on a regular basis. So the largest of Yuan's offer for Hummel was actually the private library of Wang Shunan, a former Qing official who decided to sell his personal collection in 1928, perhaps out of financial necessity. So Yuan learned of this from a fellow book collector who was close to Wang and relayed the news to Hummel. So eventually Wang's library was sold to LC in 1929. So Wang's library had enough editions that would seem to warrant its custody within China as opposed to giving it away to the Americans. But the fact that Yuan acted as an intermediary pushing for the negotiation between the two sides indicates that he was also quite flexible, even as the director of a national library, on the issue of whether rare books should be kept at home or could be sent abroad. So archival records do not tell us his rationale, but I postulate that this flexibility came from his thorough knowledge of the composition of major libraries, major Chinese collections, both abroad and within China, which allowed him to evaluate the value of any particular book or collection for parties that desire it. So maybe one's books would be a valuable addition to the LC, but perhaps not great enough for Yuan's own library to purchase, which after all had the best collection of Chinese rare books in the world. So records from the LC archives shows that from 1927 to 1937, at least 1,900 titles were secured by Yuan for Hamo. So quantitatively speaking, this actually took up a minor percentage in the LC's total Chinese accession during the same period, which was over 9,500 titles. But qualitatively speaking, Yuan's contributions were extraordinary, evidenced by the lengthy discussion of these books by Hamo and his assistants in the LC annual reports. And as we have seen, this was largely owing to Yuan's network and position in Beijing, as well as his knowledge of Chinese books and book collections. So this working relationship was not just one way. Yuan had been the most active seeker of the remaining volumes of the Yongle Dadian, the 15th century manuscript encyclopedia that underwent severe loss and destruction in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Over the years, he tracked down Yongle Dadian from across the world, and LC actually happened to be the overseas institution that had the largest number of extant remains. Through Hamo's assistance, all the 40 volumes in the LC were photostated for the National Beiping Library in the 1930s. And because the Yongle Dadian contained many pre-15th century texts that could no longer be found elsewhere, these copies became important research materials for Chinese scholars of literature, history, linguistics, and other related fields. The collaboration culminated into the proposal of a formal exchange program between the two national libraries in 1936. Initially suggested by Yuan and coordinated by the American Council of Learned Societies, the proposal was for the LC to receive selected copies of the National Beiping Library's rare book holdings, while the latter would get, quote, scientific articles and the like, end quote. So this vague phrasing that's in the correspondence between the two sides suggests that the American side was willing to offer Yuan whatever it could furnish that were, quote, so much in demand on the part of Chinese scholars, end quote. So this would make the exchange, if realized, a central channel through which Yuan's library could acquire latest scholarly publications from the West for Chinese academics and scientists. The most innovative aspect of the proposed exchange lies in the use of the microfilm, as opposed to the printed matter as a medium of exchange. As a technology, the potential of microphotography had just been realized in the US earlier in the 1930s. So the camera to be used for the exchange was custom-made by Dr. Rupert Drader, a surgeon in the US Navy and one of the first designers of microphotographic cameras. So similar to the photostat, microfilm could promote the international circulation of Chinese texts while keeping the rare books at home. And compared to the printed medium, it had the advantage of storing much larger quantities of text in much smaller and portable rolls of film, ideal for long-distance circulation and long-term storage of research material. It was planned that microfilm cameras and projectors were to be installed in both libraries for making and reading the film upon a basis of regular exchange. Unfortunately, war broke out in China in July 1937 before anything in the proposal could be materialized. As Beiping became the first city to fall under Japanese invasion, Yuan and half of his library staff fled to southwest China with the rest of the Chinese academia. Fortunately, before that, 102 crates of the National Beiping Library's rarest holdings had been transferred to safe houses in Shanghai. And after a long discussion involving Yuan, the LC, the Chinese ambassador to the US, and the State Department, it was decided that these rare books would be temporarily transferred to LC for wartime safekeeping. And in late 1941, all of them were loaded onto ships that carried them to the other side of the Pacific Ocean. It was agreed that in Washington, D.C., these books would be microfilmed, with multiple copies produced for distribution, both for sinologists internationally and for scholars back in China. Eventually, 2.5 million pages of film consisting of over 2,700 works were produced. Copies or portions of copies were purchased by at least 6 Western institutions, and 2 copies were sent back to China after the war ended. Meanwhile, Wang Zhongming, a staff member of the National Beiping Library and a student of Yuan, was sent to LC by Yuan in 1939 to conduct bibliographical study of the LC's Chinese collection. So this was actually to answer an early request from Hummel, who had been trying to bring the LC's Chinese holdings to the attention of sinologists across the world, but could not find no scholars with enough bibliographical expertise in the US to carry out this work. So Wang's study did result in this book a descriptive catalog of rare Chinese books in the Library of Congress. And he was also responsible for actually microfilming the National Beiping Library's rare books after they arrived in LC, and he also prepared bibliographical notes for them that's attached to the microfilm. So with the Chinese Communist Revolution in 1949, the collaboration between the 2 libraries came to an end. Yuan fled from China and settled down in the US, and the 102 crates of books eventually returned to Taiwan in 1965. But I hope I've shown in this presentation the Transpacific movement of Chinese books as an interactive process involving Chinese and American actors who acted upon each other's goals and concerns. From a longer-term historical perspective, this movement of books belonged to the larger story of accumulating non-Western materials that laid a foundation for the rise of area studies in the second half of the 20th century. As a prime mover of this collaboration, Yuan Tongli's connection stretched from the bibliophile circle in North China to scientists in the US capital. This reminds us the importance of studying the history of books within the dynamics of social networks, and in this case, transnational dynamics. The use of photographic technologies enable text sharing beyond national borders without compromising the growing association between rare books and the nation. This calls our attention to the ways different mediums of text were historically understood and deployed. So this research is still not complete. Among other things, there was actually a bookstore run by a staff member of the National Beiping Library that played a very important role in acquiring Chinese books from Beijing, not just for the Library of Congress, but also for the University of Chicago and for Columbia University during the Second World War, so during the war. So, so far nobody has studied this bookstore very extensively, so basically I'm trying to find more archival records about it. So everything that I've laid out today is based on the archival records from the Library of Congress. Their archive is not very well organized, but yeah, I'm trying to dig further into their archive and also other archives in the U.S. and elsewhere. So and to see how this fits into the story of Biblio-Internationalism. And with this, I'll end it here. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Could I please call our new scholars up to the front? Thank you for these marvelous presentations. In order to get the conversation going, I'll take the first question. We'll open up the floor to all of you. I would ask that when you do ask your question, in the spirit of introductions, in the spirit of welcome, if you could please introduce yourselves to our new scholars. So the question that I have for all 3 of you is that as we invite you into this community of bibliographers, I'd like to invite you to reflect on how bibliography motivates your research. How did you first come to study the lives of texts? What insights has this methodology enabled? And what further avenues do you hope to pursue as bibliographers?
I can start as person in the first chair. So this presentation specifically was motivated by a very basic question that I had as a librarian, which is I was a public librarian working in a county library system that had 14, I think 15 branches total. And in our entire holdings, we didn't have any copies of Stone Butch Blues, which I was kind of curious, who here has like heard of Stone Butch Blues before? Okay, yeah, so like this is like, if you're gay at some point in your life, someone is like, read Stone Butch Blues. And normally that happens like kind of like once a year, sometimes once a year in June. It's like every gay book list has Stone Butch Blues on it. So I was just very perplexed, and there's a kind of a more complicated answer that I can get into if people are curious that has to do with self-published books and how public libraries can acquire them. But for me, it was that kind of very basic motivation and through the like practical, use of the book. But I think as someone who works on queer and trans history broadly, it's really impossible to think about that without thinking about the printing and distribution of books because of how deeply it has been politicized. So many of the thinkers and presses that are important to my work were being surveilled by the FBI for printing and distributing books. From the mid-20th century onward, Leslie Feinberg had an FBI file that was open until she died. I mean, it's just inextricable, and if you're really interested in finding out about people whose histories have been lost, being able to trace a bibliography as provided by a press, as you can go into an archive, look at the complete distribution catalog for a place like Firebrand, and find 10 or 15 people whose work is essentially lost, but whose ideas have shaped the way that, I personally am approaching things, and I wouldn't have known that if I wasn't able to go through and, kind of materially trace everything. So it just felt like an inevitable research methodology for me.
Hi. I'm coming at it from an art historical perspective. I'm doing a PhD in art history, and that's why I think the New Scholar program is so wonderful, because it allows this sort of interdisciplinary crossover. And my dissertation is on the revival of artistic lithography, and through this study, I found out that some of these actors, very early on, before they started the revival proper, had this magazine. And the more I looked into it, the more I had to find out about it. And like the introduction said, it's the first chapter of my book. That's ambitious, of my dissertation. You heard it here first. But I thought the crossover is quite logical from art history, being interested in materiality and how things are made, and thinking of a book cover to cover, really in this sense, it being lithography cover to cover. And that's something I don't think in the art history discipline. You tend to separate the image from the text, and everyone who's discussed the Neolith has only kept it separate, and I thought we should try to find some connections when we look at it as a whole project as it was made.
How I got into this? Well, I guess it has to do with my own background. I mean, so I've always been interested in China-U.S. Transpacific exchange. As someone born and raised in China and came to the U.S. for college, so and also I like books, so I just basically try to combine these two interests, right? So here we go. And well, I think one of the next steps for me. So I'll admit. Everything I've presented so far today is based more on the archives than on the books themselves. But the one of the next steps that I will take, going further into this research, is to go to the Library of Congress, go to Chicago, go to Harvard Engine, go to Columbia, to look at these books that arrived in these collections in that period, to examine these books myself, right? Because archival records don't tell you everything, especially the sort of invisible, maneuvering or agency consideration that went into exchange. So I think Yuan Tongli, the protagonist in my presentation, is a very good example of this. Like he really decided on a case-by-case basis whether a particular book or a particular collection could be shared with or could be shipped abroad to Europeans or Americans all should be better kept at home, right? So I think, but he never says too much about this in the letters he exchanged with other people. So, so by examining the book myself, I will be able to know how valuable these books really are in that context. And also the other thing that I'm trying to do that's slightly different is that, so, I mean, we usually, I mean, I don't know, but I guess bibliography, we take bibliography as a methodology, right? So as sort of a set of skills, knowledge that we use to address questions that we want to pursue further, right, as humanistic scholars. But part of what I'm trying to do in my dissertation is to historicize bibliography a little bit, to treat the history of bibliography as the object of my study. So one thread in the narrative of my dissertation is how Chinese bibliography, as a set of expertise, experience, skills, whatever, how it went from this early modern, more organic ecosystem of book dealers, philological scholars, and book collectors, to, in the 20th century, a more sort of institutionalized bibliography that's being incorporated into research libraries, into universities. So, I mean, the 20th century is a time that witnessed the formal sort of establishment of bibliography in China, and also, I believe in elsewhere as well, the formal establishment of bibliography as a specialized field, right? So I'm interested in this process, right? So this transformation of bibliography as a body of knowledge, specialized knowledge from the early modern to the modern period. So yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. There's a mic that is circulating the room, so if there are any questions from the audience, we would be happy to take them.
I'm Terry Bellinger. Those of you who have had my illustration course at Rare Book School inflicted on them will be amused to know that an English dealer had the first 4 issues of the Neolith available for sale, and I've just bought them for Rare Book School with many thanks to the speaker.
Hi, I'm Sarah Werner. I'm editor of PBSA. I was really struck, especially in I'm blanking on everybody's names, because all I can think of is Leslie Feinberg. Leslie Feinberg and the librarian who was the point of exchange between, between China and Library of Congress, how much there is this individual, this one person who's exerting such a huge influence over the field. I am not as immersed, I want to say Edith Nesbit, I am not as immersed in the work, the period that you've been focused on, but I'm wondering too about this idea of how do we work think about what it means that there's an individual who's exerting so much influence and how that might shape or not shape the questions we ask of it. All 3 of you, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the grand scheme of queer and trans history, the individual is a very kind of like problematic figure, right? Because this is all coalitional organizing, coalitional work. We think of Leslie, we think of Nancy Bariano, who's editing the book, the several people who looked at drafts of it, Amber Hollabaugh, who encouraged Leslie to send it in. This is all like work being done in a community. And I think one of the kind of fascinating things is that because Leslie is used as this figurehead, it feels like almost like a kind of like willful ignorance around her work, which was so much about showing the collective and pushing for the collective and saying, I'm here to talk to you about what we can all do together, what liberation looks like as a collective project. So it is a very complicated thing. At the same time, if you have a recognizable figure, that person helps carry a narrative, carry a story out into the world. But I think that like the lesson we learned from Leslie's work is that like Leslie alone was not creating the possibility for that book to exist and for trans people to organize together. It was about the community infrastructure behind it. And I think that's part of what this tries to do, is to look at, you know, how a book doesn't circulate just through one person writing it, you know.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, so yeah, he was influential. I mean, I guess the short answer to your question is yes and no. So yes, because Yuan was influential, primarily due to his position as the most as the director of the National Library, and he was also, I mean, this is something I didn't mention in the presentation, but he was perhaps the most active library builder in China in the first half of the 20th century. He not only led the National Beiping Library, but also he trained a generation of professional Chinese librarians. He was the president of the first, the earliest Chinese Library Association, so the professional organization for librarians. So he was tremendously influential in this inaugural generation of Chinese librarians. So and he's very well connected. He's a very, very social person, as you can, you know, as I read through his correspondence, he's very, very good at making friends. Really, so yeah, I mean, but at the same time, he's not the only one in this story. So in my sort of larger dissertation, I also trace. So Yuan is part of a coterie of librarians, perhaps a little bit over a dozen individuals, Chinese librarians who was involved in this Sino-US exchange. So they were generally trained in the US or in American-style institutions in China, and then trained in American library schools, and then had a lot of interactions with universities, organizations such as the Rockefeller, and also with research libraries like the Library of Congress. So they really played an important role as sort of the mediating force between the two countries, and played an important role in acquiring, cataloging books for sinological collections. So not just the Library of Congress, but the Harvard Yanjing Library, Columbia, and to a certain degree Chicago, and several other institutions as well. So they really played a very important role in this larger story.
And I can just very briefly chime in. We do have, like I said, the editors that have their mission that they want, but what really interested me is the shared goals amongst the contributors, and this was never meant to be a money-making scheme. Each of the editors put forward £10, and they didn't ask for any advertisements in the papers, so it was really a mission on the one part for the lithographers who wanted to practice and experiment with the medium, and we don't have any real archives about Price that I found yet about how he asked people, but it's just such a small world. I think it's really these networks amongst this mission. But like I said with Nesbitt, she reached out to anyone she read and liked, and more frequently than not, they were sort of in this Fabian world. So they all do sort of end up being quite similar.
Hello, thank you all so much for 3 really amazing presentations. My name is Emily Spinagle, and I'm on the council class for 2027. I thought it was interesting that each of your presentations is focusing on this missional or intentional use of printing or publication to bear out a larger ideal. And as collaborative as each of these are, there's still this kind of notion of control in each of one. So there's this intentional choice of co-opting what lithography was in the 20th century, or leveraging microphotography and photo duplication processes of the early 20th centuries, and also self-publication, which in some circles we consider a failure. And so I'm curious if each of you could just briefly focus in again on that intentional choice to use those technologies, because I think that's really fascinating that all 3 are using it to their greatest abilities. And thank you so much.
I can start. Thank you. That's a great question. I mean, yeah, right. Self-publishing is, that's like the death of your book. Like, authors are told, like, if you're considering self-publishing, like, maybe just go back to your, regular activities. But I think, you know, as I was trying to express for Leslie, it was both a political commitment and a way that saw past this really troubling time in the 90s and 2000s where these groups of publishers that had weathered so much in continuing to put out books and, you know, distribute the books that they had been publishing were all being forced to shut down. And this is part of the broader collapse of the independent bookstores and, you know, the introduction of Amazon, you know, just the changing tides of mainstream publishers kind of picking a couple token authors and then leaving everyone else to the wayside. So there's a ton that goes into that and kind of behind that. But I think for Leslie, self-publishing was what she thought would be the most stable way actually for her book to continue existing, and it has been. I mean, you can go anywhere you can just go to your computer, type in Stone Butch Blues PDF, and you'll find a copy of it, and it might not be the one Leslie put out, but it's one that somebody downloaded and posted somewhere else on the internet. So it has actually created this kind of strange longevity that will like outlast any, you know, LGBT publisher, you know, like every active, I don't want to say every active because we avoid things like that, obviously, but the vast majority of LGBT publishers that were active in 2000 are either like kind of low-level dormant, still like active by, you know, having a website open or closed. So in that way, it was the right decision for the book. And I think that my original research question where I was like, why can't I get a copy of this book? It was in fact because it was self-published and because the library that I was working at had very specific contracts with Ingram and Baker and Taylor, which the librarians in the room will know. And we were allowed to get kind of case-by-case exceptions for local authors or, you know, books that were being distributed through Amazon that were self-published, but buying a book through Lulu at that time was not something that we could do. So in a way, it was the choice that created the greatest level of access online, but in terms of the actual like physical material world, some bookstores can buy through like formally distributed channels, some can't. Some libraries can, you know, the New York Public Library has like 30 copies of Stone Butch Blues because they've like made that choice and found out a way to buy it. So it really just depends, but it was a choice that was made for a very particular reason, and you know, we could say didn't backfire. Like it was the choice that like created longevity and did maintain that control over the book and the way it was presented. And I don't know if that answers.
From the artistic standpoint of lithography and how it came about from the Central School, there was a lithographic revival in the end of the previous century, but it didn't do as well. They're really competing with other art forms, especially the etching revival. And so it sort of teetered out. And then you have Jackson, who's teaching it at schools. And again, we don't have the direct archival references for this, but I think it's just that you had all of these people who were so excited about it, and they wanted to really push it, and that's why I kept using the word sort of experiment, and I think that's how it really began. And it wasn't printed at the school, it was printed at a smaller printing firm. I can talk more about that later. But part of my wider research, why I'm interested in the revival and how it reached its peak, I think, during the First World War, is why did people care about lithography? Why did it touch them? And I think a big part of that is what I address with the autographic hand. So there is something about this materiality really impacting people as they're viewing it. And again, I think this all sort of coalesces in this time where the socialism is on the rise, or people are starting to think more about how the lower middle classes are being affected, and so I think it all sort of coalesces quite well. So it's all a little competing, but it all does amount to this climate, I think.
Sandra, that's a very good question. And something that I've always trying to highlight in my study. So I mean, Yuan was very, very sensitive to latest developments in the international library world. So photostating and microfilm were actually two of the arguably the most important invention in the American library community in this period. So he was quick to identify their efficacy for his own purposes, and so he was able to make use of them, as in the ways that I just talked about. But also, at the same time, these technologies do have their limitations. So, photostat in the context of China at that time, they were expensive machines. So, as I mentioned, there were only two, I think, photostat machines in China, and the predominant method of text copying remained hand copying. So that because scribal labor in China was cheap, so most libraries in China still resorted to that traditional method. So photostat was a very sort of niche, very new and very niche sort of usage in the Chinese library community. But I mean, the advantage of photostat over hand copying, other than the ones I've identified, is that they are not prone to error if you want to circulate text, right? So there are two sides. And also for microfilm, I mean, they are ideal for storage, but they are not that ideal for reading. I'm sure. So especially at this early stage of the history of microfilm, in the 1930s, this technology was still at a very early experimental stage. It has not entered mass reproduction. This camera is custom designed by one of its first designers. So, I need to further track down how many, the extent to which these microfilm reproductions of Chinese real books were actually being used by scholars, right, across the world. So this is something that I think I need to work further on. But I suspect, they were used very substantively. So I mean, people would naturally resort more to the books themselves rather than to those microfilm. So that's my guess. So yeah.
So we've got time for one more question, which please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Christopher Walsh, and my question is more for Mindi, unfortunately, but I'm really struck by the political elements in all three of the projects, Feinberg and the Neolith. But I wonder if Mindi, you could say more about Yuan Tongni's political situation in China at the time, and maybe even a little bit about how his project was received after 1949, kind of the after effects of the massive political upheavals there. Thank you.
Thank you. So the political, well, yeah. So part of the reason that he always befriended American scholars associations is because of a lack of enough resources in China. So the first half of the 20th century was a period of frequent turmoil, social political turmoil. So Yuan's library, as well, the same for the Chinese academic community at large, was constantly beset by a lack of resources and change in government and war situations like that. So they were faced with this frequent hardship and difficulties. So I think. So as for the post-1949 reception of Yuan Tongni, so during the Mao period, it was mostly negative, right? So a watchdog of American imperialism, something like that, right? So, but in recent decades, I mean, in China, especially in the past 2 decades, there has been a revival of interest in figures, individuals associated with the U.S. So in the period before 1949, so there's a lot of commemorative activities about Yuan, dedicated to Yuan, and I know Yuan's son and granddaughter who's still alive, and they've helped me a lot in this project. So yeah, there has been a revival of interest in the past two decades, and there are scholars in China working on similar stuff right now too. So.
Thank you, Mindi. I wonder if Cassandra and Clara, do you have any thoughts on the political lens of your projects that you want to add before we close out for the day?
Well, it would just be reiterating what was in my talk, but yeah.
yeah, I think, to reiterate the words of Leslie, free Palestine and trans liberation now.
Right. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to our wonderful new scholars. I hope we can continue these conversations over coffee over the rest of the day. Thank you to our new scholars committee for their wisdom and their insight in choosing such a wonderful group. So please go have coffee, enjoy, and please come back by 3 o'clock to enjoy a keynote lecture from Nora C. Benedict and for our business meeting.